So like Matt said, I'd like to talk a little bit about the impacts on sows and boars from these increases in barn temperatures. I'm going to try to spend most of my time focusing on production values and where you should be looking in your record systems to see how the heat is impacting your farm. But I will deviate a little bit into some of the research we have going on at Purdue, but not bore you too much with it. So let's start out talking about if you've been to any big conferences or talked to people at the National Pork Board over the past several years. They've been trying to get some estimates out there on how much our industry is impacted by heat. And so a paper in 2003 tried to actually put some economic values to it, and at that time it was estimated at more than $350 million a year in cost to the swine industry from the impacts of heat. Those values have not been adjusted for inflation or the increase in feed costs that we've seen since 2003. So probably the statement that would hit us all at home a little better would be Dr. Steve Pullman's comment that it's probably double the impact of PRRS. So I'd like to kind of give you some values today that support maybe Dr. Pullman's thoughts there and how and what parts of the sow or production measures in the sow and the boar are going to be impacted. So even in Indiana, where today it's hard to believe that we have such high temperature spikes over the summer when we're freezing our butts off today, it's about 25% of our year then that we have these elevated ambient temperatures. So you'll see milk production, body weights, wean to estrus interval are some of the kind of first things that you think about. In the boar studs, you're going to think about total sperm produced and quality of that ejaculate that go down. A lot of these impacts are longer than just during the summer months. So we have some kind of ongoing impacts throughout the year from heat events during those summer months. So let me just give you a little bit about the physiology of the pig and how their body adapts to changes in heat. So we probably know that pigs don't sweat particularly well. So their skin has thermoreceptors that respond to increases in ambient temperature. And when they have that response, basically what happens first is all of their blood, not all of it, but they have a system where their blood shunts to the extremities to try to dissipate the heat. When that happens, when the blood flow kind of goes towards the skin, they're left with a reduction in blood flow to their GI tract, probably the number one problem there. And when that happens, you have a little bit of a breakdown in the gut. So if you've ever heard the term leaky gut, or you've ever had a really stressful event at home and you've ended up over the toilet for a little while, it's all kind of the same thing. There's a breakdown in the cells of the gut that are protecting kind of the bad things from getting into the animal. And so when that happens, you have an animal who is going to not eat as much and not be able to absorb nutrients as well. The other things that are going to happen is if the dissipation of heat by kind of shunting the blood to the skin becomes ineffective, if it's really hot, then they're going to start to pant. So when that pig starts to pant, they're going to basically reduce their feed intake even more. So you have an animal that has a reduction in feed intake and poor nutrient absorption. So taken together, that's going to really change the physiology of that animal. So you'll see weight loss. In the sows, you'll see a reduction in milk production. Embryo development will be impaired. And then in the boar, you'll see that's where we get the effects of semen output and quality. So a friend of mine who I was consulting with before this talk used the terms lead and lag. So when you're looking at your production records to see how heat is impacting your farm, I want to go through what are the lead indicators and the lag indicators. So what are you going to see in those summer months? And then when should you be looking at your records for those lag effects that will be coming up later? So the lead effects are going to be what you're going to see right away in the summer. So you'll see extended wean to estrus intervals, a higher number that are not pregnant by 7 days. The stillborn rates are going to go up, repeat services, and then you'll start to see delayed puberty and irregular cycles in your gilts. Then we'll go through some of the lag rates. So we're going to have to look in our records several months down the road, preg rates, farrowing rates, total born, mummies, and I want to kind of talk about the difference in stillborn and mummy records, and then also some of your kind of economic drivers that you may be looking at, like weaned per mated female per year. So I sent out a couple emails to some friends in the industry to get some real production data for you. So I'm going to be showing several different farms' data, as well as some of the data from SMS, from Ron Ketchum's group at SMS, just to kind of drive home some of my points. So these two are looking at, starting with the sow, kind of what you would see on a sow farm. And this was a 5,600 pen gestation unit that's in the Midwestern U.S. So similar in terms of the highs and lows in temperature in the summers as we are here in Indiana. So probably the first thing you're going to notice during the summer is going to be the increase in the wean to estrus interval. So here you can see you're going to be averaging this across your herd, so you may see a couple of days. So this farm in June was around 6 days wean to estrus interval on average, and about 7.8 wean to estrus interval days in September. So as that heat of that end of the summer kind of really sets in the Midwest, you'll start to see that increase. So kind of going right along with that, this percentage of repeat services will be another thing you'll see during the summer, that you'll have more that don't get pregnant the first time and you'll have to start to breed back. This first slide here on the left is straight out of the National Hog Farmer series that Dr. Ron Ketchum does and Mark Fix. And this is kind of looking at stillborns. This was an interesting series of articles they did where they looked at Canada's kind of production records and then compared northern USA farms to southern USA farms, and they used the Mason-Dixon line as the divider between the north and the south. And so I guess we fit in the north here in Indiana. So the north didn't have quite as big of some of these fluctuations as the south, and Canada isn't usually as impacted by heat as we are here. But the stillborn rates are going to be something you're going to see at the time. So in the heat of the barn, when the sow has even the smallest amount of trouble during labor, you'll start to see a high incidence of stillborns. And when the barn is extra hot, she will give up and kind of run out of energy a little faster during labor. So the stillborn rates are going to be a lead effect. You will see it during those hot months from her running out of energy during farrowing. This data over here was a 6,000 sow farm that is in crate gestation, again here in the Midwest. And if you see, the pink line is the mummies and the blue line is the stillborns. And through the summer months, it is the stillborns that you're going to see going up. So those are lead effects during the heat. Same, still lead effects. This is going back to that 5,600 pen gestation farm. But you can see that 35-day preg rates and farrowing rates, sorry, we're getting into lag effects. 35-day preg rates and farrowing rates are also going to take a hit. So you see the 35-day preg rate here. This is starting in June. You don't really see any effects, but by the time those June breedings are starting to come into play in late July and August and maybe into September, you're going to see a reduction in preg rates there. Similarly, if you follow those pigs all the way to farrowing, you're going to see a reduction in farrowing rate then in December, January, February timeframes of the year. Total born, I don't think, is always quite as easy to really see big time impacts when you look at total born. I think that the kind of indicators of heat are a little more evident when you focus on stillborns during the actual heat events and mummies following up later. Total born, there's so much variation in total born that it can be hard to really start to peel those apart. And you might be only looking for about a half a pig change. So depending on what your normal variability is, that can be easier or harder to detect depending on your farm. So I find that coming back to this 5,600 pen gestation, you can see that whereas the pink line was really steady through the actual summer, it's now the pink line that is very variable when you get towards the lag effects when they're actually farrowing, that you're going to see a little bit of a mummy effect. So you'll basically know that during the heat events of the summer, some of those early developing fetuses basically didn't survive, and so you'll see those effects at farrowing, but the impacts were actually made during those heat events in the summer. Few other things to look at. This is from MetaFarm's data from the 6,000 sow farm. Again, another lag effect would be looking at some of these pigs weaned per mated female per year. So if you look at the November numbers here, it's kind of greatly reduced. This is one of the biggest reductions you see out of the entire year. And so that's going to be a lag effect when you get into those December, January farrowings that were bred during the heat of the year. So I just want to talk for a minute about what is considered heat stress in our sows. And so this graph up here on the left looks at the high and low temperatures in Indiana. Now I have actually no idea how totally reliable my data sources are. This is Google. But it'll give us at least an idea of how hot we really do get here in Indiana. But if we look at usclimatedata.com, what they think we go to, you can see kind of the highs and the lows. So how hot do we really get in June, July, and August? So we're usually up somewhere in the 80s to 85 in the midsummer, and now we're having these days where we're spiking pretty high above that. So on average, we're sitting in the 85s, and then we have days where we're spiking up into the 90s, and maybe once in a while we're getting into the hundreds these days. So this is actually looking at humidity as well. So again, what is summer in Indiana like for humidity? Well, we know we're usually above 50% for most of the summer, and some of our barns are probably getting pretty high. We have quite a few high humid summer days. The pit and the level of the pit in your barn can be adjusting your humidity up as well. So those are things that we might be a little higher in the barn than we are outside. So, whoopsie. So what does the sow think? So this is one of the temperature heat index charts that are available on the World Wide Web. And this one basically has a couple of different stages of heat and what is considered moderate, mild, and severe heat stress for the pig. So over here in this light yellow category is moderate, mild. Here in this kind of mid category is kind of getting a moderate heat stress. Orange is severe, and red is pretty much you're risking death at that point. So if we try to take Indiana summers and see where we fall on the temperature scale here, probably averaging somewhere between 84 and 86. And if we come down here, as soon as relative humidity is somewhere above 65%, your pigs are getting into the moderate, basically a medium heat stress. And at this rate, you'll start to see impacts of the sow. So as soon as they kind of cross over into this lighter orange category, that's when you'll start to see reductions in feed intake and things like that. So how good are our barns at kind of protecting these pigs from these outside environmental temperatures? So I'm by no means a physicist on airflow and things, but it's kind of my moral of the story is that once you get about 70% humidity, the best our ventilation systems can do is reduce about 10%, 10 degrees Fahrenheit in a barn. That's what I'm going with at the moment. So on these days when we spike up into the 90s, it's pretty hard to get our barns to cool off, and it's 70% humidity. It's pretty hard to get our barns to cool off more than another 10 degrees beyond outside temperature. Now, if you're lucky enough to be working in a boar stud these days that has air conditioning, this is a totally moot point today. But I don't think that there are many of you here today, so. Okay, so basically let's look at the calendar year then and just kind of go through what we said. So if we're looking at what's going on during June, July, and August, we are probably going to be in this moderate or maybe even getting into more of a severe heat stress for our sows. So those are the things you're going to be looking at right away are the wean to estrus interval, your repeat breeders, and your percent stillborns. Okay, if we move down again, some of these lag rates then, September, October during the year, you need to be looking at your preg rates. 35-day, 75-day, however many times you do your preg checks. We need to be looking at those lag effects during September, October, and November to see if we've had any impacts of heat. And then again, making sure that December, January, February, that's when those lag effects on litter sizes, total borns, and start to look at your mummies. Your mummies will start to tell you if you have some lag effects there as well. So a couple management tips on the sow side would be, how important supplemental cooling is in gestation and lactation. So I always want to tell people to July 1st is a really bad time to be going in the barn and checking whether or not all of your cooling mechanisms work. Okay, so probably in Indiana, if we could start in May, starting to make sure that everything in the barn is working and our cooling systems are working would be a little bit of a better time. This past year, we had pretty high spikes in temperature even in June. So getting those things, cool fans, drippers, everything that you're going to be using for cooling those sows, making sure they're working will be important. The other thing is most barn workers are coming to work pretty early in the morning, but the earlier you can feed those sows before it heats up for the day, the more likely they are to get up and eat. Once the temperature has gotten pretty hot in the barn, it's hard to get those sows interested in getting up and eating. The most important thing we can do during this time is keep those sows on feed. Once they go off feed, we have a shutdown in the whole kind of system from them reproductively speaking. So getting them fed early in the morning and up to eat is important. Probably breeding them when it's kind of cool as well. You'll notice that they're not very likely to want to do much or be cooperative when it's very hot. I feel the same way, frankly. So I can understand. So getting them up and bred in the morning before it gets hot is also a good idea. The other part of that is that your heat check bores, whoever you're using to stimulate your sows, they are also not quite as good in the heat of the day. They don't tend to produce as many pheromones, and they don't tend to want to be as active. So if you need a good heat check bore, he's probably going to be better off for you in the morning as well. It's been said in some places that their water consumption in sows could go up as much as 50% during the summer months. So making sure you have good water flow rates and enough water to let those sows drink as much as they want. And then we could probably get into discussions of water quality at some point, but making sure you have a good clean water source if they're going to be increasing their consumption 50%. The other kind of best thing you can do during the summer months because of that stillborn issue is to monitor as many farrowings as you can. So if you can't be 24 hours, any additional time that you can cover those farrowings during the summer months especially will be a big saver in that stillborn rate because you'll have a much higher number of sows that are going to get tired quicker. So a couple just on the sow side, a couple things that Purdue is doing. We've had actually a big group of researchers kind of come together to address different areas of heat stress mitigation. And this is stemming from the fact that the National Pork Board has been putting out requests for proposals on heat stress mitigation for several years now. And so several of us at Purdue have kind of started to put together some things. So I personally have been working on some nutritional mitigation strategies, seeing if there's some supplements that we could feed to sows over the summer to prevent such drastic changes or maintain their feed intake. So this is a couple of slides. We actually conducted this project down in South America during their summer. They have a little bit of a different summer than Indiana does. So they are in Chile, they're right on the ocean, and they have a nice breeze all the time. So where they get really hot in temperature, they don't have the humidity like we have in Indiana. So it was a little bit of a different heat. But we tried a feed supplement called betaine, and we were feeding betaine during lactation only to sows. And we did find that the betaine supplement managed to, during the high heat of the summer, increase the sows' feed intake. So they didn't have the same reduction in feed intake that the control sows did. We also had a little bit of a shift in the wean to estrus interval. So where the heat stress normal sows went to have about a day longer wean to estrus interval, not as many of the betaine sows had that. We repeated it here at Purdue in a little bit more of a controlled heat stress to make sure they had plenty of humidity and temperature increases, and we fed the same amount of betaine. We didn't have very many animals in this treatment. In this study, it was kind of a pilot study. We only had about 5 sows per treatment. But what we looked at was that wean to estrus interval impact. So we ultrasounded their ovaries twice a day, every day after weaning to kind of determine how their follicles grew on their ovary and if they ovulated at the same time. So we noticed that the betaine-fed group had larger follicles coming out of the farrowing house, so being fed during lactation. As soon as they were weaned, the betaine sows already had an increase in their follicle size coming out of the farrowing barn, and they maintained that larger follicle size all the way to ovulation. They ovulated at the same time point or at the same kind of follicle size, but they had an earlier wean to estrus interval. Some other people at Purdue, Dr. Schinkel's here, and he's collaborating with some of the bioengineering people, and they've actually designed a cooling pad to be put into the stall in the farrowing barn. So here you can see this sow is standing on this, it's an aluminum, I believe, plate, and it has water pipes that run through it to basically cool down the sows. So some of their preliminary data is pretty neat in terms of how well these pads can work to actually cool the sow down. So if you look at the sow here on the left, this is a thermal imaging camera. And so where it's bright white, we're in about 41 degrees Celsius. That's wicked hot. Okay, and that's where you see right here on her mammary glands are nice and warm. She's producing a lot of milk. You can see there's her piglets here, her head's up here, here's her body, but you see her body is staying pretty hot here in the red. When she's on the pad and the pad is turned on, her mammary glands are still pretty warm, but the rest of her body has then cooled down quite a bit. So they've seen with these pads, they've tried a couple of different flow rates to see how fast they need to pump cool water through to remove the heat from the sow. So we're going to look at several slides here that looked at this study, which has control will be in the red, which is just laying on the pad with no water flowing through it. And then they had 3 different flow rates, low, medium, and high. And that's kind of just how fast they were circulating water through. And if you kind of look here, the respiration rates of the sows, they were put in rooms that were about 31 degrees Celsius, so getting close to 89, 90 degrees. And you basically see that those sows are hot, and so that worked, and these sows are just laying on a pad with no water flowing through it, so they were nice and hot, and their respiration rate was really high. And so here it is kind of before they started heating the room. Once they heated the room, those control sows kept getting hotter, and their respiration rate stayed high, and all of the sows that are on some sort of a flow rate on that cooling pad had a reduction in their respiration rate. So that means that from a metabolic cost, they're saving us a lot on metabolic costs because they aren't having to pant. Okay, similar things with the temperature of their vagina. So they took vaginal temperatures. Once they heated up the room, those control sows got nice and hot, and these different flow rates have cooled down those sows in their vaginal temperature. So right now, those pads are being tested on farrowing parameters. So we've only really done physiological parameters of the sow, but those cooling pads have been able to bring those sows physiologically back down to kind of normal, thermoneutral physiological measures, and we are farrowing on them now and looking at lactation performance records and things on those pads. A couple other things about cooling sows. This was another study done at Purdue in collaboration with the USDA group at Purdue. And what we looked at here was how to actually cool the sow. So if you have a sow on farm who you notice is panting like crazy and really hot, you know, we would usually run and grab buckets of cold water or try to hose her down and try to help her cool off. So we actually looked at the rate at which you cool the sow down and how does it impact her on the next breeding. So we took gilts and we heated them up for 2 days, and then we rapidly cooled them, which was dousing them with some cool water, versus slow cooling them, which was moving them to a different barn and letting them kind of cool down a little bit slower. And then we bred them. So then they were fed some matrix, they were bred, and we looked at how their fetuses developed in that next farrowing after being rapidly cooled or slow cooled. So this was kind of interesting. So basically the moral of the story is that the rapidly cooling, dousing them with cold water and having their temperature come way down, negatively impacted them for the next farrowing. So they actually were 1.1 piglet reduction in litter size by rapidly cooling them instead of slow cooling them. So I'm not quite sure how to translate that on farm yet, or if it's useful, but it is something interesting because I think from a production practice we tend to, if we see her, maybe we would hose her off, and we might need to think about other ways on farm if we see a sow that is getting a little warm or down and panting. What are the best ways for us to really cool her down might need to be thought about. Okay, I'm going to switch gears to the boar for a few minutes. So this is looking at normal morphology over a couple of years, so this is by week, and this was a large integrated system, and a couple of their bore studs are here. Each line is a different bore stud. And so I've highlighted for you here in the middle the weeks of the year that would be considered the summer. And so I just think if you're trying to find out the impacts of heat on the male, it's about clear as mud for you right now, isn't it? So it can be hard to find how bad heat is being impacted on the bore side compared to the sow side. The records seem a little bit clearer. So if you just look at normal morphology, where you might expect semen quality to go down during the summer, it probably doesn't jump off your record system for you. And so a lot of things go into that. Number one is the rate at which the boars are young and coming into the farm. So that's going to increase the variability. When your vaccination schedule could increase your variability. Lameness issues and illness in the boars that kind of causes them to have issues with semen quality. You're going to get so much variation that finding seasonal effects can be a little bit challenging. So then I asked this system to send me their discard rate instead. So this might be a little bit of a clearer picture, but I wouldn't say it's crystal clear. But if you're going to look for something in the bore stud about how are your boars being impacted by heat, the rejected rate might be something a little bit clearer to look at. I think there's going to be an association with genetic line, so you should definitely separate it out by line if you have different genetics in the stud, because there are definitely some boar lines that are more susceptible to heat than others. So if you look here at the summer months, then you definitely see more of an increasing trend. These are just two different groupings of their bore studs based on how they evaluate semen. So in both ways of evaluating semen, you can see there is a slight increase or trend for an increase in rejected ejaculate rates over the summer. So I personally think in the boar side, you're going to have to look a little bit more at each individual boar over time to figure out if they're being impacted by the heat. So I want to just kind of do a quick rundown of spermatogenesis so that I can explain why I think you have to go kind of boar by boar. So when I was an undergrad, or I was just an early grad student, Dr. Flowers talked me through some of these slides, so I stole them from his teaching thing to understand how spermatogenesis happens. So it's a continuous process. It's always going on in the boar. And basically what he has in his testicle is what we call the resting pool. So in his testicle are these stem cells that when they get a little trigger to develop, they are kind of just hanging out in the testicle, all these stem cells, and whenever they get a message, some of them begin to divide and start to create sperm cells. So the developing pool is going to be what happens basically every couple of days. I kind of think of it as like a little assembly line, and every couple of days a package gets delivered, and those are the stem cells that are going to start to divide to make sperm. And so every couple of days you're kind of going to fill this assembly line going down, and those sperm cells then begin to divide and mature, and then they're going to move into the epididymis. So that's going to be the organ that wraps around the testicle, and they're going to continue to mature as they move through that, and then they'll be stored in the tail of the epididymis, and they wait there until they're ejaculated, or they'll trickle out in the pee. Those are their only two fates. So the timeline that it takes to start in this development pool and make it to the sperm cell that is eligible for ejaculation is about 7 weeks. So you have to really think about that when you're evaluating semen today, because that could contain sperm cells that were actually impacted 7 weeks ago. And then if I have the end of an illness happen today, I can't expect that ejaculate to look perfect next week, because the sperm cells that are in that developing pool throughout the testicle, they take 7 weeks to come out into the ejaculate. So there's a big time delay when you're evaluating semen on the male side. So if you look at stress, if there is a moderate stress, so if we go back to the thoughts on what is considered a moderate and a severe heat stress in the sow, we don't have a lot of data for the male that says that they are any different. So I'm going to go with their data. So if we're in the 80s and we're under 70% humidity, we're in a moderate, kind of mild or moderate heat stress. So in that situation, you might not see changes in the ejaculate right then. So in the summer, if it's only in the 80s and it's only about 65% humidity, you might not see any negative impacts in the ejaculates you're processing today. But what will be impacted are kind of the really early developing sperm cells in the testicle. So in about 5 or 6 weeks, you might see a reduction in semen quality. And it's kind of this delayed effect if it's just a moderate heat stress. If it's a severe heat stress, so if we're over 85 degrees and over 70% humidity, that would be considered a severe heat stress. And then you're going to see that change probably immediately in the ejaculate, as well as for the next several weeks afterwards. So if you look at one individual bore at a time, okay, and you know when a stress has occurred, okay, it might be 1 or 2 weeks before you start to see some sort of a decrease, and then it gets back to normal. So you can tell if these are moderate or severe heat stresses by looking at how long it takes for the dip to happen. So here, if you look at stress 2, it went down pretty quickly, versus stress 3 took a few weeks. So this would be considered a severe stress that only took a week or two. You saw those changes right away, and it took several weeks to get back to normal. Okay, if it's more of a moderate heat stress, it might be several weeks away, and then it tanks. So if you see some bores that start to change in their semen production, you have to look backwards and then continue to look forward several weeks to kind of get a good idea of what is the cause. So again, if it's heat, it could be moderate or severe. You can see some dips from vaccinations. You can see dips when they have a fever, if they got sick, if something broke. So you'll need to be able to look backwards and forwards in your records a little bit to determine what the cause is. So at Purdue, we've been doing a little bit of research on mitigation strategies for the male as well. So that same feed additive betaine that we looked at in the sows, we've done, we're on the second study with it now, but we did one big study out with Honor company out in Oklahoma at their boar stud in Oklahoma during the summer several years ago, and we fed the betaine supplement to the boars over the summer, and we got an increase in total sperm production. It was about 3 billion cells breeding doses per ejaculate. So we got about 9 billion sperm cells per ejaculate more in the boars that were supplemented the betaine. So that was only about a total of about 5% increase in sperm production. So I'm not sure we're bending the needle too much there. But betaine is actually relatively cheap to feed. Boars are pretty cheap to feed anyway, but betaine's relatively cheap to add in there. So we're repeating it again here at Purdue with some other feed additives in conjunction with it. And the reason for that is that it was one of the coolest summers on record in Oklahoma a couple years ago, so I'm not sure those boars were actually that impacted by the heat. Our barn temperatures would tell you that we did not hit anywhere into that moderate to severe heat stress out there. So a 5% increase with no heat actually makes that number look a little bit better. So we're trying it again right now at Purdue. They just finished their heat stress, and this was a very good heat stress. And I can report back to you on how well that's kind of working. One other factor to consider that we're looking at Purdue, and this maybe is not captured well in our record-keeping systems on the sow farms or the boar studs, but it's something that I think has more of an impact than we may know. And that is looking at the animals that are in utero during a heat stress event to the mother. So the sows that are pregnant during the summer months, what are the impacts of that heat on those developing offspring? So there's been some historical data that has shown that if you heat up a sow during pregnancy, you'll see that there's a lower survival rate, and the birth weight is going to be lower of those piglets. And then recently, some work has been done to show that those piglets actually have a change in their metabolic rate, and they are metabolically not as efficient as pigs that are gestated during a non-heat event. So this is some data that came out of the University of Missouri, and they were looking at this in utero heat stress in gilts. So they looked at total born in the blue, number born alive here in the pink, the green is number weaned, and then they have some runts and things down here. And so the big difference here is looking at the numbers of piglets that are weaned. Now this is not from the mother that was being heat stressed. These are from gilts who were gestated either during heat or during a thermoneutral time frame. So this is looking at a year later, what is the effect from those piglets that were in utero during a heat stress event versus not? And so these gilts are not as efficient and do not produce as good of litters as the ones that are basically gestated during a thermoneutral time frame. So we brought some boars to Purdue that were heat stressed as well. So they have environmental chambers where it's all very controlled heat stress. So the mothers were heat stressed from days 30 to 60 of gestation. So basically the second trimester of gestation, they underwent a heat stress event. So I can argue that that's not, I can't think of a time in Indiana where we have a month of heat and the month before and the month after aren't heat. But this is the first project. We'll see if we can get some more. But these boars just hit puberty and have been being collected at Purdue. And the boars that were gestated in a thermoneutral environment are producing about 10 billion sperm cells more than the boars that were gestated in a heat stress environment for just 30 days of gestation. So you can see kind of the big impact that a heat event has on those developing offspring and changes their basically productive lifespan from that. So I think that there's probably some impacts to our industry from this, whether it is selecting gilts out of certain seasons of the year where they wouldn't have been a heat stressed in utero, or perhaps even selecting boars in different seasons of the year. So I'm going to start looking through some kind of metadata analyses from some companies, if they'll let me into some of their data, to look at boar lifetime production being born in different seasons and see if we can come up with something there. So just to kind of circle back to what does heat impact our industry? You know, I think we need to know a little bit more, but I think that we do have some impacts of heat. And at the moment, our Earth is on a warming zone or in a warming trend. And so I think we're going to have some more high heat days and more days each year that kind of get into those severe heat categories. So I think we know what it's going to do to the sows. We might know what it does to the boars. We probably don't have a good idea of what it's doing to those in utero developing animals. We do know what it does to our growing pigs. It reduces feed intake and average daily gain. But I do think we have the impact is probably pretty great. So I can't drive home enough managing temperature in your barns and making sure that everything's working and you're getting airflow going through those barns and keeping everybody cool.